today. Please give a big Lincoln welcome. You can clap and whoop and holler for Elizabeth Loftus.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay with this microphone? It's working good. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk with you about the work that I and my collaborators have done in the area of memory. And since I'm going to be talking about memory, I think we all have to acknowledge that memory is pretty important for all of us. Without memory, I mean, you wouldn't know how to find your car keys, or how to make the toast in the morning, or how to walk to the bus stop, or all the things that we rely on memory for. That assembly of the happy things that have happened to us in our lives and some of the unhappy things. But I want to ask you a question about memory that I've asked a lot of people. Do you think that I could make you remember something that did not happen? Do you think I could make you remember, for example, if I wanted to, could I make you remember that you saw a cat when you were a kid stuck in a tree and you went up there and rescued that cat? Could I make you remember that if it didn't happen? Could I make you remember that as a child you were attacked by a vicious animal if it never happened? Could I make you remember that as a teenager you committed a crime and the crime was serious enough that the police actually came to investigate? Could I make you remember that a week ago, just a week ago, you were playing a card game and you took money out of the game bank that you weren't entitled to take? Could I make you remember these things? Could I pour these ideas into your mind and make you believe and remember that you had these experiences if they didn't happen? And when I posed this question to people, their first reaction was, well, no, I'm not going to remember I was attacked by an animal. If I wasn't, why would I ever do that? And who would confess to a crime if you didn't commit the crime? But we'll see how you feel in another 40 minutes or so. So over these many years, I've developed a couple of paradigms for investigating memory. And one of the paradigms will be somewhat familiar to psychology students. It's called the Misinformation Paradigm. And what happens in this research is we will show people some kind of an event. I like to show crimes, simulated crimes, or accidents. That's my favorite thing to use. But some kind of complex event. Afterwards, we're going to expose these witnesses to some post-event information of some sort, often misleading information, and then we'll test people to see what is it that they themselves remember. And so, for example, we've done many studies where we show people simulated accidents, we give them some misleading post-event information about the accident, then we test them to see, what do you personally remember about that accident you saw a day ago, an hour ago, a week ago, or whenever it was that they saw it? In one of my earliest studies, we showed people a simulated accident where a car goes through an intersection controlled by a stop sign. And as for post-event information, we insinuate that it's a yield sign, not a stop sign. And after we do that, many people will believe and remember and can even visualize and draw for you a scene with a yield sign, or I guess you call it give way sign, controlling that intersection. When I was first publishing these studies showing the power of misleading post-event information to affect what people remember, I would sometimes get a criticism, you know, these are simulated crimes, they're on film or, you know, staged, they're not real events. Maybe if people saw a real crime or a real accident, these same kinds of memory distortions wouldn't be as likely? That's a really good question. That's a question about whether the experiments that we do really map onto the kinds of things that happen out there in the real world. And we as researchers in this field have a number of ways of responding to that concern. One of those ways is to go out and study people who have been exposed to a highly stressful, upsetting event for some reason, and to then see whether their memory is capable of being contaminated. And I've been fortunate enough to work with a psychiatrist named Charles Morgan, who has access to a really, really interesting group of people. These are soldiers who, in our country, we have soldiers who get trained. They go to survival school. They get training on what it's going to be like for them if they're ever captured as prisoners of war. So they go through a couple of weeks survival school that is extremely arousing, upsetting. One piece of that survival school involves a very, very hostile 30-minute interrogation. It's arousing, upsetting, it's stressful. It's an interrogation that takes place as a piece of this survival school. Well, I talked Dr. Morgan into introducing misinformation into one of the experiences with these survival school soldiers. And so after they had gone through this horrible interrogation, they got some misinformation about the chief person who was conducting that interrogation. So they might have seen an interrogator who's the guy on your left, but they get misinformation that is the guy on your right. How we supplied that misinformation, it was relatively easy. Later on, we're saying something like, I want to ask you about this interrogation you had by this interrogator. When you were in that interrogation room being questioned by him, did he let you talk to any other people? Did he give you a blanket? Did he give you anything to eat? But the picture you're holding up is a different person. So that's how the post-event misinformation was introduced, and many of the soldiers, these trained soldiers, then went on to identify what I call the misidentified man, the one in the photo, as the person who had conducted that interrogation. And often he didn't even remotely resemble the actual interrogator. We did some other things with these soldiers by supplying post-event misinformation. So, for example, in that interrogation room, there was no telephone. There was no weapon on any interrogator. The main interrogator, none of them were wearing glasses. And if the soldiers had not been exposed to any misinformation, they rarely later claimed to have seen those objects. Not never, but rarely. So maybe 10% said they saw a telephone in the room, and very few claimed to have seen the weapon or glasses that did not exist. But look what happened with the soldiers who got misinformation about those objects being in the interrogation room. Now, most of them claimed they saw a telephone, and a significant minority said they saw a weapon on that interrogator and that he was wearing glasses. So, I've now introduced you to something that is in the psychology textbooks now, something called the misinformation effect. This is kind of a cartoon drawing of the effect. You expose people to misinformation about some event they have experienced, you put them in a misled condition, and it depresses their memory performance. So why is this important? Because out there in the real world, misinformation is all over the place. We get misinformation when we are interrogated by people who maybe have an agenda, communicate ideas to us, even inadvertently. We can get misinformation when we have conversations with other people at the scene of some accident or crime, and somebody blurts out something that's incorrect. We often get misinformation from the media that might be reporting on an event and especially if it's a high publicity event that we might have seen ourselves. All of these provide opportunities for a person to become exposed to some post-event misinformation that can contaminate, distort, or transform the memory. So, I've been doing this work on misinformation and talking about the malleability of memory for quite some time. And then it was really in the 90s that I began to see just an altogether much more bizarre kind of memory problem cropping up, where people were going into psychotherapy. Maybe they had one kind of problem, maybe they were depressed, maybe they were anxious, they had an eating disorder. And they came out of this therapy with a different problem. They had now what they believed were memories of horrific traumatization and abuse that had happened to them early in their life. Sometimes they were remembering bizarre things like being forced into satanic rituals, being forced into killing animals, breeding babies, sacrificing the babies. Something what seemed to be going on in this questionable psychotherapy that was leading these patients to these uncorroborated memories. And there was a terrific book that report that got published by a behavioral scientist investigator with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, who had looked into all of these claims, particularly the satanic ritual abuse claims, and said he could never find any corroborating information. So I started looking at these cases, and I'm thinking to myself, I really would like to study. How is it? This is not turning a stop sign into a give away sign. This is not making a soldier believe he saw a weapon on his interrogator when he didn't. Changing a detail or adding a detail here and there to an event that actually happened. Something else is going on here. These people are developing very richly detailed memories for things that were unlikely to have actually happened. So this old misinformation paradigm really didn't seem like it was going to cut it. I needed to develop a better paradigm so I could explore how do you plant this seed of suggestion and does it grow into one of these gigantic, richly detailed experiences that feel like memory. And so we developed what is now called the rich false memory paradigm, where there's no event to begin with, but we're going to apply people with suggestions about the past, and then we're going to test them and see what they remember about their childhood or about their more recent past. All right, you're a researcher, and you want to do this. You've got this idea that you want to apply people with suggestion and plant maybe a childhood memory, but what are you going to plant? What are you going to do? And I sat around for a couple of years with my graduate students and other collaborators trying to figure out what kind of memory do I want to plant? Because one thing I had to think about is the ethical issues. As you here may and probably know, if you're connected to a university or college campus and you're doing research with human beings, you need to go through a process. You need to give your proposed study to a committee, and that ethics committee or human subjects review committee will review your proposal, and they will either allow you to do the study, they'll request modifications, they'll disallow. Even in the name of science, we can't just do anything we want to our research participants. So I needed to come up with something I could plant. It didn't seem like our committee was going to look too kindly on me trying to convince subjects that their parents forced them into satanic rituals and made them sacrifice animals and breed babies. We needed to find an analog, and that is something that a lot of psychological research does. Something I could plant that if it had happened, it would have been at least mildly traumatic. At least mildly traumatic. And that's when we came up with the idea, why don't we try to make people believe and remember that when they were 5 or 6 years old, they were lost in a shopping mall. They were frightened, they were crying, and they were ultimately rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. And just briefly, the way we planted the memory, if I was doing this with Tim, for example, I'd say, Tim, you know, I've had a chance, excuse me, to talk to your mother and found out some things that happened to you when you were 5 or 6 years old. We just want to see if you remember the things your mother told us about. And if you don't remember, just say, I don't remember that one. And then I present to you, because I would have really talked to your mother, 3 true experiences, things that his mother told me really did happen, and then a completely made-up scenario about how he was lost in a shopping mall, or if he grew up in an area where there were no shopping malls, he was lost in a big public place with particular people there at a particular age. He was rescued and reunited with the family. After just a few suggestive interviews, about a quarter of our sample of ordinary, healthy adults fell sway to the suggestion and began to remember all or part of this made-up experience. And you know, I remember even before I had a chance to publish these findings, people were attacking this study. They could kind of see where we were going, that maybe I was going to suggest that the psychotherapy was highly suggestive and it was harming patients. People criticized this study, and maybe you're thinking yourself, well, getting lost is so common. I mean, if you want to talk about false memories or distorted memories on the same page or in the same paragraph as some of what these patients are remembering about satanic ritual abuse, I mean, at least show I should implant a false memory for something that would be a little more arousing, upsetting, unusual, bizarre, if it had actually happened. And many other investigators from around the world, many in Britain, in Australia, New Zealand, other parts of the United States, Canada, other parts of the world, stepped up to this challenge and contributed to this scientific literature. And so one group in Tennessee planted a false memory that when you were 5 or 6 years old, you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard, succeeding with about a third of their subjects. A group in Canada planted a false memory that when you were a kid, you were attacked by a vicious animal or you had a serious indoor or outdoor accident. They're getting better than we were, succeeding with about 50% of their sample. And more recently, published in Psych Science, another Canadian study planted a false memory that when you were a teenager, you committed a crime, and it was serious enough that the police actually came to investigate. These investigators reported success, that is, people falling sway to the suggestion and developing this false memory that they committed a crime, something completely made up with the help of the parents. They reported success in 70% of the sample. This was astonishing even to a bunch of memory researchers, and a few of them got together and reanalyzed the crime, the false confession to a crime data, and tried to apply a somewhat more conservative coding scheme. They knocked the success rate down to 30 or 35% if you are a little more conservative in how you code, whether someone fell for the suggestion or not, because there's some leeway in making that decision as a researcher. And I still say pretty impressive that you can get about a third of people to basically confess that they committed a crime and that it was serious enough that the police actually came to investigate. How often does it happen that across these studies, using this rich false memory technique, do people fall for the suggestion and develop a false memory? There was they call it a mega-analysis, not meta, because it didn't use all of the meta rules, but it's a mega-analysis where a group from Britain, the United States, and Canada got together. They're the names of the investigators, you might know some of them, and they analyzed the memory reports from a whole bunch of these rich false memory studies to address the question of how often are people falling for this across a large number of subjects. They had memory reports from 423 subjects who had been put through this kind of procedure, and they reported, using a common coding scheme, and a fairly conservative one, that about 30% of the time people developed a false memory that they'd had this experience, different in different studies, you know, attacked by an animal in one, nearly drowned kind of thing, or something else in another. But an additional 23% developed a belief that this had happened to them, even though they didn't go so far as to have a feeling of recollection. That's important to us because we sometimes believe that if you can get somebody to believe that something has happened to them, it's often that first step on that royal road to developing a false memory. I've told you about the rich false memory technique, but there are other techniques, many of them used in some psychotherapy circles, that also have been shown recently over the last couple of decades to lead people to false memories. So, guided imagination, that goes on in some therapy. Guided imagination, you know, in the therapy it's, you know, you're depressed, you're anxious, you have an eating disorder. Most people I've seen with those symptoms were sexually abused as a child. Oh, you say you weren't? Nothing like that happened? Why don't you just close your eyes and imagine who might have done that to you? How old might you have been? Where might it have happened? So we as researchers began to wonder, what does this guided imagination procedure do to people who didn't have the experience? And that work shows that guided imagination can lead people to develop false memories of having had experiences that they previously denied. Sexualized dream interpretation, hypnosis with highly hypnotizable people, exposing people to other people's memories, or blind people with false information. These are different ways that researchers in this area have produced very rich false memories in the minds of otherwise healthy, ordinary adults. So when I moved jobs about 20 years ago or so to the University of California Irvine, I decided what I wanted to look at was, if I plant a false memory in you, does it have consequences for you? Does it have repercussions? Does it affect your thoughts, your intentions, or even your behavior? And this was work that I did with two of my then graduate students, Kara Laney and Aaron Morris. And we have even in this very room one of the students of Kara Laney, who is now a professor here at Lincoln. Well, I guess you'd actually call you a lecturer, but to me, you're a professor too. So, and so we, with a postdoc, did this work where we decided that we would plant a false memory that when you were a kid, you got sick on a particular food. For some people, you got sick on eggs. For other people, you got sick on pickles. For other people, you got sick on something fattening like strawberry ice cream. And when we planted these false memories or beliefs in the minds of our subjects, people weren't as interested in eating those foods. In fact, we and others did some studies where we put people in front of foods so they could eat what they wanted to eat. And there were foods in front of them. And if we had planted successfully a false memory of having gotten sick on the food, people didn't eat as much of those offending foods. We even thought to ourselves, I wonder if you could do the opposite. Could we plant a warm, fuzzy memory about a healthy food, like asparagus? And maybe people would want to eat more asparagus. And yes, indeed, that is what we found. And we also found that these techniques work not just for food, but we could plant a false memory that you got sick as a teenager on a vodka drink, and people aren't as interested in having a vodka drink. This hasn't worked for me, but it did seem to work for our subjects. And so, in these experiments, we're showing that with this mind technology, you can affect people's subsequent thoughts, their intentions, and even their behavior. And this raises a whole lot of questions, this work. And so, because I have given talks about this line of research for quite a while, I know some of the things that people are interested in, some of the questions they have. Maybe these might be questions you're thinking about now too. Like this one, is there any way to tell the difference between a true memory and a false memory? So not too long ago, I was reading my hometown newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, and having coffee, reading the paper, like I do most mornings, and there had been some stories reported in the LA Times about an accusation against a famous actor named Woody Allen. Because long ago, when Woody Allen was in a really, really messy separation and custody situation with his partner, Mia Farrow, 7-year-old daughter, Dylan, had made an accusation of abuse. It was investigated by the people at the Yale Medical School. There was no finding of abuse, and it sort of died down. But now, jump ahead to current times, and the now grown-up Dylan is saying, well, maybe in this Me Too world, people will now believe me that he molested me when I was 7 years old. Someone wrote a letter to the editor about this newly reiterated report of Dylan Farrow. And you can't read that letter, but I've blown up the part that I want you to see. She says, as a therapist who has worked with many sexual abuse victims, I can recognize when the stories are valid, and Dylan Farrow's story rings very true. And I'm sitting here with my coffee and my LA Times, reading the letter from this therapist, thinking to myself, what is ringing for her? What rings for people that makes you think that what is being said is true? What I think does ring for many people is if there's emotion that is expressed while the person is recounting their experience. So it's natural to ask, well, is it the case that, let's say, true memories are emotional, but false memories not so emotional? And this is exactly the dissertation question of my former student and your advisor, Dr. Carolini, and she asked this question: are false memories less emotional than true ones? So she planted in her dissertation work she planted false memories of things that would have been upsetting, like you accidentally caught your parents having sex, or you witnessed your parents having a physically violent, fight. She planted that memory in the minds of some people. She found other people who truly had that experience, either accidentally catching their parents having sex or, witnessing their parents in a violent fight. And she compared the emotional reactions, and the overwhelming finding here is that those false memories were just as emotional for people as the true ones. Supporting a finding by Richard McNally, the Harvard clinical psychologist, who's basically proclaimed that emotionality is no guarantee that you're dealing with an authentic memory. Well, maybe maybe the brain knows. Maybe we could put people into something like a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine and get some brain scans while they're remembering something that's true versus something that's false, and maybe the brain would be able to tell the difference. And so I teamed up with a couple of people who know about brain imaging. We put people into an fMRI machine while they were recounting a true memory or a false one that had been suggested to them, and the overwhelming finding is the similarity of the neural signals for a false memory and a true memory. So we are a long, long way away from ever being able to do something like the legal system would maybe like to do, which is put a witness into one of those fMRI machines and let them recount their memory and let the machine say whether it's real or not. I get asked this question: is everyone susceptible to these kinds of manipulations? Are we all susceptible? Well, there is a group of people in our who we share the planet with. They have super memories. They have exceptional memories. I don't know if you've ever seen them on TV or read about them. They've been studied extensively by the neurobiologists on my campus at UC Irvine. They can remember just about everything they did every day of their adult life. They remember a whole lot about public events. They're pretty extraordinary. They've been featured on a lot of news programs. Articles have been written about them. So my research group, the graduate students in particular, teamed up with the neurobiology research group that had been studying these individuals with a superior memory. They're called HSAMs, highly superior autobiographical memory, and put these individuals through a bunch of false memory paradigms. There's the group of researchers that also include Jim McGaugh, who was one of the early people studying these extraordinary memory people. And we took those HSAMs, the people with a superior memory, we had age-match controls, we ran them through a whole bunch of false memory paradigms. And what I loved about this study, I mean, the academics here will probably really appreciate it. It didn't matter how this came out, it was going to be interesting. It was going to be interesting, and it was going to be worthy of publication. These special people were either going to be susceptible, they were going to be immune, they were going to be susceptible on some tasks but not others. However it came out, it was going to be interesting. And what we found, reporting it in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is that those HSAMs, the superior memory people, had just as many false memories as those age-match controls. More recently, with my collaborators, these three graduate students who are now PhDs, Cochran, Greenspan, and Bogart, we put a little twist on the false memory contamination procedure. We call this memory blindness. In a memory blindness study, you're basically getting a report from someone, and later on you're going back to them and saying, earlier you told me this. Most of those misinformation studies, we say to somebody, you know that event you experienced? Well, this other witness says something that's basically wrong. But here, we're telling people that their earlier report is something different from what it really was. So they might have seen a simulated crime where this bad guy knocks into a woman, she drops her bag, he takes her wallet out of the bag, he puts it in the pocket of his green jacket. And afterwards, we question people about their experiences. What do they remember? By the way, do you happen to remember the thief's jacket and what color it was? Well, a lot of people can accurately remember that the color was green. But when we go back to them later, we're going to mislead them. We're going to tell them, You know, when we questioned you earlier and asked you about the jacket, you told us it was this other color, kind of a brownish color. And we now want to ask you, do you know anything about the brand of that jacket? Do you recognize who made the jacket? So we've given them fake information about their early response. Do they even detect it? They rarely show any evidence that they have detected. Sometimes they do, but it affects their subsequent memory. They buy into this new version of what they supposedly previously said. More recently, in memory blindness, using a memory blindness procedure, we have manipulated people's memories for symptoms, in particular the pain that they might have experienced during a particular event. We accomplish this by using the cold pressure task, where, if you don't know it, people have to put their hand in ice cold water, 90 seconds in really, really cold water. It's very painful. Later on, they're going to give a pain rating and say, how painful was that for you? And maybe they say, I'd give it an 80. It was really an 80. But later on, we're going to give them some fake information about what they previously said. So they may have said 80, but we go back to them and we say, you know, earlier you told us that that was a 60 on a 100-point scale. Why did you rate it that way? And they tell us. And now we subsequently ask them to remember how painful it was for them. Before I tell you that, did anybody detect that we had given them the wrong pain rating? That it was different from what they really said? In terms of any evidence of concurrent detection, only a little over a tenth of the subjects showed any evidence of any kind of detection. And later on, 1 or 2 days later, when they tell you how painful was that experience for you, they rate it as less painful. I won't walk you through these graphs because I don't have access to a laser right now. Moreover, there's even a marginal effect on their willingness, their future willingness to want to participate in the study. This shows you, when we ask them, how much do you think people should be paid in order to go through that painful cold pressure task? If their pain rating was distorted and made lower, they don't think people need to be paid quite as much, that marginal result. And we published this result just a few years ago. So again, memory blindness is memory for people's own earlier reports. Just a few weeks ago, I got information that Otkar from Maastricht University, and he just got this paper accepted in JARMAC, the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition. He's using this memory blindness to plant very rich false memories. So he asked people about a lot of childhood experiences, and one critical one is embedded in this list. You know, you went swimming and you actually, your swimming trunks or swimming outfit fell off, you know, while you were swimming. People deny it, but later on, you go back to them, you say, here's some things you told us happened to you. When we questioned you earlier, you told us you had this experience. And they advertise this in the title of their paper, a new way, a new method to plant false memories. I just think it was very clever, and it's hot off the presses from this Maastricht research group who do a lot of work on false memories. By the way, you can see that we use a lot of deception in this research to get people to believe things that didn't happen. But you don't need it. You could just encourage people to lie or make up a story about something that didn't happen. And so in the dissertation research of my former student, Stephen Frenda, they made up a story that when they were a kid, they saw a cat stuck in a tree and they rescued the cat. They were supposed to write, they would write an average of about 250 words, a very convincing story. Their job was to make it so convincing it could convince other people it really happened. And after this little storytelling or lying exercise, a number of people started to believe and remember that they had made-up experience. All right, here we are. We're learning a lot about mind engineering. By planting false memories, we can get people to believe in things that didn't happen. It can affect their future thoughts, their intentions, their behavior. So there's a problem for us in society. There are ethical issues that arise here. And first and foremost among them is, should we ever use these mind engineering techniques to help people, for example, to help them live a happier or healthier life? Or should we be banning the use of these techniques? When I look into the future, I worry. Because, well, we'll step back. I worry that technology is going to make it even easier and be a more powerful way to contaminate people's memories. We've already seen some pretty good evidence that doctored photographs can affect what people believe and remember. In some studies we did a few years ago, we showed people photographs and asked them whether they remember these public events happening. As they looked at these photographs, they thought they were real, true photographs of things that happened. So here's a photograph of our former President Obama shaking the hand of the former President of Iran. Remember that happening? Yeah, some people would remember it, and they would tell you where they saw it. They saw the photo, where they learned about the event. Here's another one that we used. This is a former President, George Bush, vacationing during a massive hurricane on his Texas ranch with a famous baseball player. Remember that? A number of people said, oh yeah, remember that. Well, they couldn't have seen these because they were created with Photoshop. And yet, a number of people said, yes, I remember those made-up doctored photos. And whether they fell for the suggestion depended on, in this case, their prior biases and beliefs. So it was really the conservative Republicans who were more likely to fall for a suggestion that made the liberal Democratic president look bad. But those conservative Republicans were somewhat less likely to fall for the suggestion that made the conservative Republican former president look bad. And we're beginning to see here an example of something, motivated false memory. People are more likely to accept suggestions if they fit with your prior beliefs or even wishes. I teamed up with some Irish investigators. Murphy is the lead author of this work, and we were able to actually introduce some false information, fake news, during Ireland's referendum on abortion. You may know that Ireland had amongst the most restrictive abortion laws on the books. That's before Texas and the United States and some other conservative states that tried to outdo Ireland. But there was a referendum to overturn these restrictions, remove these restrictions on abortion. It did pass. And during this active referendum, we created some fake news, presented it to individuals who are living in Ireland, potential voters, and the fake news either made the pro-choice people look bad, or it made the anti-abortion people look bad. And again, without walking you through the exact numbers, people were more likely to fall for a suggestion and claim that they had seen these non-existent fake news stories if it fit with their predispositions. So they would believe a story that made the pro-choice people look bad if they were anti-abortion people, and vice versa. Here's one of my favorite Photoshop studies that affected people's memories. It was done by Rob Nash here in Britain. Rob happens to be a memory researcher, very good one. He also happens to be my academic great-grandson. I won't take you through the whole lineage there, but and he was studying people's memories for the departure of the wedding by Kate and William. And so there's a scene from the actual departure of the 2011 wedding, and he presented either the true scene to individuals who, of course, might have seen it on television or whatever, or he did a Photoshop scene where he added in a whole bunch of protesters and sort of angry people on the sidelines and a lot of commotion. And after people had viewed this doctored photograph, they remembered the experience differently. They remembered it more in line with the doctored photograph. And the scary thing about Rob Nash's study is actually what happened when he did a really, really bad job of Photoshop. So bad, you know, the horses and the men don't even have their feet on the ground. It's so obviously a fake, but it too affected the memories of people for their experience with that 2011 wedding scene. And now, beyond Photoshop, we've got the deep fake problem. Deep fakes. You know that, and I can't speak of, I'm sure there are people in this room, probably maybe many people who know more about how the technology works in a deep fake, but basically you can make a video and get someone to be saying or doing anything you want them to be saying or doing. One of the first famous ones that circulated in the United States was a deep fake. It sounded like our former President Obama. It was his voice, it was his accent, his lips were moving, and it looked like he was saying exactly this, but really it was an actor speaking into this computer system that was saying the words that it looked like Obama was saying. And an article that described this particular deepfake then gave an example. You could make him say something that he'd be unlikely to say, at least publicly. He might be a little bit more likely now, but for many years he was too polite. And I just read in the last week that there was circulating a deep fake of Zelensky calling on the Ukrainian citizens to put down their arms and surrender to the Russians. And apparently it got removed pretty quickly. But that's the kind of thing you can do with a deep fake. So this is really going to give people memories and beliefs for things that didn't happen. Wonderful article I read about this. Mostly I love the title, which was "Fake Media is Coming for Our Memories." So I asked you a little while ago, do you think I could make you remember things? Could I pour these ideas into your mind if they didn't happen? Could I make you remember that you rescued a cat stuck in a tree when you were a kid? Or that you were attacked by a vicious animal as a kid? Or that as a teenager you committed a crime and it was a serious one? Or a week ago, and I didn't talk about this work, very clever work done here in Britain by Wayne Nash and others, you cheated in a card game and you took money out of the game bank that you weren't entitled to take. All of these have been created in the minds of ordinary people through the power of suggestion. And so I leave you now with, if I've learned anything in decades of doing this kind of work, it is this, and this is one of the things that I often talk about when I'm involved as a consultant or an expert witness in court cases. Just because somebody tells you something, and they say it with a lot of confidence, and just because they describe it in a lot of detail, and just because they cry when they tell you the story, it doesn't mean that it really happened. You need independent corroboration to know whether you're dealing with an authentic memory or one that's a product of some other process, suggestion, imagination, misinterpreting dream experiences as reality, or whatever. And so, I guess my last slide, I always loved Salvador Dali, and he had this famous quote, which I think he didn't quite get right. So his quote was, "The difference between false memories and true ones is the same as for jewels. It's the false ones that look the most real and the most brilliant." And if I could meet him, which he died, so I can't meet him yet, but I would say to him, you know, Sal, you didn't quite get it right. But the real story is those false memories, they're not the most real and the most brilliant, but they are and can be equally real and equally brilliant. So thank you very much for listening and inviting me to have a chance to share this work with you.